An ordinary grocery trip transforms into an unforgettable confrontation when an elderly woman directs a shocking comment at a young black man. What follows not only silences the room, but also shifts the entire dynamic of the day. It was a sunny afternoon in a small Ohio neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other. The grocery store buzzed with the usual rhythm of daily life shoppers, pushing carts, some chatting quietly, others lost in thought. Everything seemed routine, but near the produce section, that calm was about to shatter. An elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, stood adjusting her glasses. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and her faded cardigan suggested a quiet, unassuming demeanor. She muttered to herself as she reached for a bag of apples, a trace of impatience in her movements. Nearby, a young black man named Daryl, tall and dressed in a blue hoodie and jeans, reached for a bag of oranges. He was juggling a basket of groceries and texting on his phone, blending seamlessly into the ordinary scene. But then it happened. The woman turned sharply toward him, her eyes narrowing and her lips pursing. Her voice, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear, carried a biting tone. "You people don't belong here," she said. Daryl froze, his fingers suspended mid-text. Before he could process, she added, "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The room seemed to pause. A hush fell over the aisles, broken only by the occasional sound of a cartwheel squeaking or a faint cough. Some shoppers exchanged uneasy glances, others pretended not to hear. The hum of daily errands dissolved into an awkward, almost oppressive silence. Daryl's initial reaction was shock, his brow knitting together. For a moment, it seemed as though he might respond immediately. But instead, he took a deep breath, his expression becoming unreadable as he weighed his options. Around him, the atmosphere thickened. A young mother hurriedly guided her child away. An older man, near the potatoes, glanced nervously at Daryl, waiting to see what would happen next. The elderly woman stood her ground, unrepentant, adjusting her cardigan as though daring him to respond. Daryl, his basket shifting to his other hand, straightened his posture. His presence seemed to grow in the stillness. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ma'am," he began, his tone steady, "do you even realize what you just said?" The question wasn't hostile. It was almost reflective, as if offering her an opportunity to reconsider her words. But the woman showed no interest in introspection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A sharp intake of breath could be heard from a young woman near the bread aisle. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, but Daryl remained composed. He didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he let the pause linger, allowing her words to resonate uncomfortably in the ears of everyone present. Finally, Daryl nodded, his calmness both unsettling and commanding. "All right," he said, his voice resolute. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The store seemed to collectively hold its breath. Shoppers, employees, and passers-by alike were now captivated. The confrontation had turned into something more, a moment that demanded attention, reflection, and ultimately change. The stage was set, and the storm was coming. But it wasn't the kind anyone expected. Daryl shifted his weight and set his basket down on the floor with deliberate care. His calmness felt like gravity, pulling everyone closer, even those who had pretended not to notice the exchange. Fixing his gaze on the elderly woman, he didn't show anger, only a quiet determination that seemed to make her shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady but firm. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Every word carried weight, spoken like it had been carefully chosen. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," Daryl continued, pausing just long enough for his words to sink in. "He was a sharecropper, working land he didn't own, breaking his back so his kids might have a better life. His father? He was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, and sold like property. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in. The woman's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was transfixed. A man near the dairy section, who had been glancing at his phone, put it away entirely. An older couple whispered to each other but didn't look away. My grandfather, Darrell went on, his voice growing stronger, fought in World War II. He risked his life for this country, a country that sent him overseas to fight, but treated him like dirt when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him. A hush fell over the room. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter now. And my parents, he said, his tone softening but no less intense. They fought too, not with guns or fists, but by working every single day. They raised me to believe in kindness, respect, and hard work. My mother's a teacher. She spent her whole life helping kids, no matter what they look like. My father? He's a mechanic. The kind of man who'd stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down. He let his words settle, his eyes still locked on hers. So, you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa? He shook his head, his voice now tinged with sadness. Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears. The elderly woman's face flushed. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her apples. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, the words catching in her throat. Darrell took a step back, his composure unshaken. Addressing the crowd now, he said, I could have walked away. But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to be better than words like those. The weight of his words lingered, but the story wasn't over. The silence that followed was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. The elderly woman's face was a patchwork of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and something deeper. Something that looked almost like shame. She glanced around the crowd, as if searching for an ally, but none came. Finally, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap stepped forward. He's right, the man said, breaking the silence. We've got to be better than this. His words seemed to break a spell. An older woman near the frozen foods nodded. My dad fought in that same war, she said softly, her voice trembling. He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. The murmurs began to grow. A young cashier, barely out of her teens, called out from her station. I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you. The elderly woman, now visibly flustered, clutched her cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. I didn't mean, she began, but stopped herself. Darrell turned back to her, his expression softer now. It's not about what you meant, he said gently. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more. From the deli counter, a man started clapping slowly at first, hesitant. But soon, others joined in. The sound swelled, undeniable. The applause wasn't just for Darrell's words, it was for the courage he showed in confronting hate with dignity. The elderly woman glanced around one last time, her face pale, before quietly wheeling her cart toward the exit. As she walked away, a few people moved to comfort Darrell. One woman placed a hand on his shoulder and said, You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. Darrell smiled faintly, lifting his basket back into his hand. Sometimes, he said, almost to himself, it's not about winning or losing, it's about making sure people hear the truth. The crowd slowly dispersed, the tension in the air replaced by a sense of reflection. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful, but everyone seemed changed in some small way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Daryl's words was far from over. As the shoppers returned to their routines, the atmosphere in the grocery store felt different, quieter, more thoughtful. Daryl finished his shopping, his steps measured, as if processing everything that had just unfolded. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken him, but it had left him reflective. At the checkout line, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier scanned his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there?" She hesitated, then continued. "It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Daryl smiled back, his tone warm. "Sometimes, grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Daryl walked to his car, he noticed the elderly woman sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he thought about walking over to her, but decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Daryl sat with his father at the kitchen table, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, listened intently, his hands folded on the table. "You did the right thing, son," his father said finally. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, she might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do. Sometimes plant the seed and let it grow." Daryl nodded, his father's words resonating deeply. He realized that, while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it was necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only allows it to fester. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Daryl's words replayed in her mind, each one cutting through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, and for the first time, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the grocery store spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Daryl's response, his courage, and the dignity with which he handled the situation. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what's right. Daryl didn't seek attention for what he'd done, but his actions rippled through the community in ways he hadn't expected. Strangers approached him with gratitude, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had long been avoided. The elderly woman, too, began to change. It wasn't immediate, but she started to question the beliefs she had held for so long. She didn't know if she'd ever see Daryl again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean speaking calmly, with conviction, and letting the truth do the rest. To everyone watching, let this be a reminder: your words and actions matter. They can hurt, or they can heal. They can divide, or they can unite. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding to create a better world.